In the summer of 1943, a Western Union messenger bicycled up to a white clapboard house on a quiet street in Ohio and knocked on the door. The woman who answered already knew, the way all wives and mothers of that era had trained themselves to know, what a yellow envelope in a stranger's hand on a Tuesday morning meant. She took it, she signed for it. She stood in the doorway long after the boy had gone, holding a slip of paper that said her husband was missing in action somewhere in the skies over Germany. That telegram was the first. The second one came 6 weeks later. This is the story of what happened after. A story that played out in tens of thousands of American homes, in every state, in every corner of the country. The names have been changed because the names belong to no single family. But the facts behind it, the camps, the telegrams, the liberated men, and the knock at the door are as real as anything in this war. By the summer of 1943, the United States Army Air Forces had been hammering German-held Europe for over a year. The 8th Air Force flew its great bomber streams from England deep into the Reich, to Schweinfurt, to Regensburg, to the oil refineries and rail yards that kept the German war machine running. It was the most dangerous duty in uniform. On a single mission in October of that year, the 8th lost 60 bombers and 600 men over Schweinfurt alone. Those who survived to be captured were, in the grim arithmetic of the air war, among the fortunate ones. When a heavy bomber was shot down over Europe, the crew's fate fractured into pieces. Some men died in the aircraft. Some died in the parachute descent. Some were captured by German soldiers or civilians and passed into the formal PW system. And some simply vanished, leaving nothing behind but a notation in a ledger at the War Department and a yellow telegram at the door of someone who loved them. For the families back home, the sequence of official notices was its own kind of torment. First came the message that their son or husband was missing in action, a status that offered just enough hope to make the waiting unbearable. Then, if weeks passed with no confirmation of capture, the War Department amended the record. The second telegram used the phrase, "killed in action." The government held funerals. Families wept over empty graves. Gold Star banners went up in windows across America. But the government's record and the ground truth in Germany did not always agree. Roughly 94,000 Americans were held as prisoners of war in the European theater. Airmen, infantrymen, tankers, the soldiers and airmen of a dozen campaigns, from North Africa to Normandy to the Hurtgen Forest. Germany, as a signatory of the 1929 Geneva Convention and mindful of the American prisoners it needed to account for, generally kept to the treaty's minimum standards for Western Allied prisoners. The camps were not comfortable. They were cold in winter, and the food was thin. But they were not the death factories that German ideology built in the East. For most American POWs held by the Germans, the question was not whether they would survive, it was how long they would have to endure before the war found them. For a man we will call Raymond, a tail gunner from a B-17 crew of the 8th Air Force. Endurance began the morning. His aircraft took flak over a marshalling yard in central Germany and went down in a long, spinning arc into a field near the Rhine. He remembered the sequence in pieces for the rest of his life. The intercom going to static, the order to bail out, the rip of cold air at 15,000 feet, the hard landing in a plowed field, and the ring of German soldiers who were there almost before he stopped sliding. He was 24 years old. He had been flying combat missions for 11 weeks. The stalag system that received him had been running since the early years of the war. Raymond was processed through a transit camp called Dulag Luft, a standard stop for Allied airmen, where German interrogators asked questions that he answered with only his name, rank, and serial number, as the code of conduct required. Then he was shipped east by train to a permanent stalag, a sprawling compound of wooden barracks behind wire fences in the flat farmland of Central Europe. Life inside the wire settled into a rhythm that had its own dreary logic. Days were marked by the twice-daily appel, the prisoner count where men stood in lines in all weathers while German guards tallied them. Barracks held dozens of men on wooden bunks, 2 and sometimes 3 high. In winter, the stoves were cold more often than not. Red Cross parcels arrived irregularly and were the single greatest comfort the prisoners knew. Canned meat, cigarettes, powdered milk, a bar of chocolate that a man could make last a week if he was disciplined. The cigarettes became currency. A tin of condensed milk could buy favors, books the promise of a quiet afternoon. But the waiting was the hardest thing. Not fear, not cold, not hunger, the waiting. A man in a PW camp measured time by the arrivals of new prisoners who brought news of the outside world. Every new face from a freshly shot-down crew was interrogated not by the Germans, but by his fellow Americans, hungry for information. How was the bombing going? Where had the front moved? Was there any end in sight? For Raymond and for the thousands of men beside him, the answer through 1943 and 1944 was always the same: not yet. Back in Ohio, his wife had done what women of that generation did with grief. She worked. She kept the house. She took a job at the factory that had converted to war production and stood on the line for 10 hours a day, making components she was not told the purpose of. She wrote letters to an address at the War Department that acknowledged receipt but offered nothing in return. She placed a Gold Star banner in the front window and answered the same question from neighbors so many times that she learned to do it without her voice breaking. Yes, Raymond. No, they never found him. Yes, we had a service. She did not entirely believe he was dead. She could not have said why. It was not faith exactly. It was more like the refusal to let the accounting close. What she did not know, what no official communication had told her, was that a Red Cross postcard with Raymond's name on it had been mailed from a German camp in the spring of 1943. Postal delays, routing errors, the grinding chaos of wartime correspondence meant that the card arrived long after the KIA telegram was mishandled at some point in the system and never reached her. This kind of bureaucratic tragedy happened more than once. Families grieved men who were alive. Men in camps wondered why no letters came. The war was full of silences that no one intended. The winter of 1944 into 1945 broke something in the German prison system. Allied armies were advancing from the west. The Red Army was rolling toward Germany from the east. German command, fearing what Soviet troops would do to prison camps and to German guards, began evacuating the eastern stalags in January 1945, forcing prisoners onto the roads in temperatures that sometimes fell below 0 Fahrenheit. These were the long marches that survivors would describe for decades. Men in thin uniforms walking west through blizzards, sleeping in barns, eating whatever they could forage, guards growing more anxious with every kilometer the front moved closer. Raymond walked for 60 days. Men fell out of the column. Some were helped by their fellow prisoners. Some were left behind. The march was not a death march in the deliberate sense. It was not the Bataan Death March, which was something else entirely, a calculated atrocity, but men died on it anyway, from exposure and exhaustion, and the column buried them at the roadside and kept walking. By April of 1945, the Allied advance had compressed the German lines into a thin, collapsing band. American armored units were moving fast, outpacing their own supply lines, pushing into the heart of Germany, and then, on a morning in late April that Raymond would later describe as the strangest of his life, the German guards simply were not there. They had slipped away in the night. In their place, at the edge of the road, were American soldiers in M4 Shermans with white stars on their turrets. One of the tankers climbed down from his hatch and looked at the column of scarecrow men staring back at him. He was 20 years old. He had been in the army for 14 months. He had never seen anything like what was standing in front of him. He said, "Are you guys Americans?" Raymond said that they were. The processing of liberated American POW to use in the spring of 1945 was one of the most urgent logistical priorities of the Allied command. Military doctors came forward with the advancing armies to assess the men. Many were underweight, some by 30 pounds or more, some carrying injuries that had never been properly treated. Transit camps received them, fed them, began the paperwork. Priority medical cases were evacuated by air. The rest moved by truck and train to staging areas in France, then to the ports. Operation Magic Carpet, the vast sea lift that would eventually return 8 million American service members from 55 theaters of war, treated liberated POWs as among the first to go home. The Army understood that these men had been gone the longest, had suffered the most, and had families who were waiting with a particular kind of grief, the kind built on official notification of death. There were procedures for notifying families that a man previously listed as killed in action had been recovered alive. A telegram went first, a different kind of telegram. And then, if the man was well enough to travel and processing was complete, he came home himself. In Ohio, it was a Saturday in June of 1945. The war in Europe had been over for 5 weeks. The news on the radio was about the Pacific, about the Island by Iceland campaign working its way toward Japan, about the casualty estimates being whispered in Washington for the eventual invasion. Raymond's wife was in the kitchen when she heard the knock. It was not the Western Union boy this time. It was a man in uniform at the front door, and for one terrible suspended second, every nerve in her body prepared for the worst. Then she saw his face. There are moments in the history of any war that no document captures fully, moments that took place in kitchens and on doorsteps, in living rooms, and on front porches that never made it into the official record, because the people inside them were too overwhelmed to write anything down. Man's return was one of those moments. He was thin. He was not entirely well. He stood in the doorway of the house he had left 2.5 years before and looked at the woman who had placed a gold star in the window for him, and neither of them moved for a long moment. Then she took a step forward, then another. He came home. The numbers behind this story are not abstractions. Of the roughly 94,000 Americans held as prisoners of war in the European theater, the great majority survived and came home. Of the much larger number, more than 120,000 American servicemen captured across all theaters in the entire war. More than 111,000 from the Army alone were eventually returned to military control. These were men who had been written off by the paperwork, declared absent from the living, and who walked back through the door anyway. Their homecomings were not uniformly simple. Some men came home to find the world had rearranged itself in their absence. Jobs taken, leases expired, marriages that had not survived the uncertainty, children who did not remember them. Some carried wounds that never fully closed. Some never entirely left the wire behind. The transition from prisoner to civilian was its own campaign, fought on quieter ground. But they had come home. That counted for something that is not easily put into words. The families who received the gold star and then received the man himself had carried two incompatible truths simultaneously. The official truth of the government which said death and the private truth of waiting, which refused to let the accounting close. In most cases, the government's telegram was right and the waiting ended in grief. In enough cases to matter, it was wrong. And in those cases, the knock at the door that a family had dreaded for years turned out to be the thing they had stopped allowing themselves to hope for. Raymond lived to be 81. He did not talk about the camp often, and when he did, it was in fragments: the Red Cross chocolate, the cold of the January march, the face of the tanker who had climbed down from the Sherman. He kept the original Maillet telegram folded in a drawer in the bedroom. He never threw it away. Asked once why he kept it, he said it reminded him that the War Department had done its best with what it knew. He was not wrong. Wartime record-keeping operated in the dark, with incomplete information, across thousands of miles and dozens of languages. The men who sent those yellow envelopes were not cruel. They were trying to give families the most honest account of what they knew. Sometimes, what they knew was not the whole story. In the whole vast machinery of the Second World War, the assembly lines and the shipping lanes, the bomber streams and the beachheads, the telegrams and the waiting rooms, the thing that is easiest to lose sight of is this: every number and every casualty report was a person. Every yellow star in a window was a family. And sometimes, very rarely, in a way that felt like the war offering some small reparation for everything it had taken. The number came back, the star came down, the door opened, and the man who had been gone for 3 years walked back into the kitchen where someone was still waiting.